For every philosopher celebrated for their wisdom and influence, there is another who is despised for their controversial or divisive ideas. From Socrates to Nietzsche, the world of philosophy is filled with thinkers who have sparked both admiration and outrage. Let's dive into the most loved and hated philosophers of all time. Philosophers have always walked a fine line between being revered and reviled. Their ideas can either change the world for the better or stir up chaos and controversy. Some philosophers, like Socrates, were loved for their wisdom, but hated for challenging the status quo. Others, like Karl Marx, inspired revolutions but were blamed for the suffering that followed. The stakes are high. Philosophers can either shape the future or be forgotten in history. Their ideas can unite people or divide them, and their legacies often depend on how their words are interpreted long after they're gone. Number 1, Socrates. Loved for his wisdom, hated for his methods. Socrates is often called the father of Western philosophy, and for good reason. He didn't write books or give lectures. Instead, he wandered the streets of Athens, asking people tough questions. His famous Socratic method was all about questioning everything, even the things people thought they knew for sure. He believed that the only way to find truth was to admit how little we actually know. This made him a hero to those who valued honesty and self-reflection. His famous quote, "The unexamined life is not worth living," still resonates with people today who believe in the power of critical thinking. But not everyone loved Socrates. His constant questioning made him a thorn in the side of Athenian leaders. He challenged their authority, exposed their ignorance, and made powerful enemies in the process. Eventually, he was put on trial for corrupting the youth and disrespecting the gods. Despite his brilliant defense, Socrates was sentenced to death by drinking poison. His death turned him into a martyr for free thought, but it also showed how dangerous it can be to challenge the status quo. Even today, Socrates is a symbol of intellectual courage, but his story reminds us that not everyone is ready to face the truth. Number 2, Friedrich Nietzsche. Loved for his bold ideas, hated for his misinterpretations. Friedrich Nietzsche was a philosopher who wasn't afraid to shake things up. He's best known for his bold ideas like the will to power, which suggests that the driving force in humans is the desire to achieve and dominate. He also famously declared, "God is dead," not to celebrate the end of religion, but to point out that traditional values were losing their grip on society. Nietzsche believed that people needed to create their own meaning in life, rather than relying on old beliefs. This made him a hero to those who value individuality and self-creation. His work inspired existentialism and modern philosophy, and his quotes are still shared widely today. But Nietzsche's ideas were often misunderstood, and that's where the trouble began. Some people took his words out of context to justify selfishness, nihilism, or even violence. His sister, who edited his work after his death, twisted his writings to support her own political agenda, including ideas that aligned with the rising Nazi movement. This led to Nietzsche being unfairly labeled as a philosopher of hate, even though he himself despised anti-Semitism and nationalism. His mental decline in his later years only added to the controversy, as people questioned whether his radical ideas were the product of genius or madness. Despite the backlash, Nietzsche's influence is undeniable. He challenged people to think deeply about their values and to embrace life's challenges with courage. His quote, "He who fights with monsters should look to it that he himself does not become a monster," is a reminder of the dangers of losing oneself in the pursuit of power. Nietzsche may have been hated in his time, but his ideas continue to inspire those who dare to question the world around them. Number 3, Karl Marx. Loved for his critique of capitalism, hated for his political legacy. Karl Marx is one of the most influential and controversial philosophers in history. He's best known for his critique of capitalism, which he believed exploited workers and created inequality. Along with Friedrich Engels, Marx wrote the Communist Manifesto, a revolutionary text that called for workers to unite and overthrow the capitalist system. His ideas about class struggle and economic equality resonated with millions of people who felt oppressed by the wealthy elite. Marx's famous quote, "Workers of the world unite," became a rallying cry for labor movements and revolutions around the globe. But Marx's ideas also sparked intense hatred. While he envisioned a classless society where wealth was shared equally, his theories were used to justify some of the most oppressive regimes in history. Leaders like Lenin, Stalin, and Mao claimed to follow Marx's teachings, but their versions of communism led to widespread suffering, censorship, and violence. As a result, Marx became a polarizing figure, loved by those who saw him as a champion of the poor, and hated by those who blamed him for the failures of communist governments. Even today, Marx's legacy is hotly debated. Some see him as a visionary who exposed the flaws of capitalism, while others view him as a dangerous radical whose ideas led to disaster. His work continues to inspire movements for economic justice, but it also serves as a cautionary tale about how philosophy can be twisted for political gain. Whether you love him or hate him, there's no denying that Karl Marx changed the way we think about money, power, and society. Number 4, Ayn Rand. Loved for her individualism, hated for her selfishness. Ayn Rand was a philosopher who championed individualism like no one else. She believed that the highest moral purpose of a person's life was to pursue their own happiness and self-interest. Her philosophy, called objectivism, celebrated reason, capitalism, and the power of the individual. Rand's novels, like Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, became bestsellers and inspired millions of readers to embrace her ideas. Her famous quote, "The question isn't who is going to let me, it's who is going to stop me," became a mantra for those who valued personal freedom and ambition. But Rand's philosophy also made her one of the most hated figures in modern thought. Critics accused her of promoting selfishness and greed, arguing that her ideas ignored the importance of community and compassion. Rand's rejection of altruism, the idea that we should help others, was especially controversial. She believed that self-sacrifice was morally wrong, a view that many found cold and heartless. Her staunch defense of capitalism also drew criticism, particularly from those who saw it as a system that benefits the wealthy at the expense of the poor. Despite the backlash, Rand's influence is undeniable. Her ideas have shaped libertarian politics and continue to inspire entrepreneurs. Number 5, Immanuel Kant. Loved for his moral philosophy, hated for his complexity. Immanuel Kant is one of the most respected philosophers in history, known for his groundbreaking work on ethics and morality. He believed that morality isn't about following rules or seeking rewards. It's about doing what's right, because it's right. His idea of the categorical imperative is a cornerstone of modern ethics. It basically means that you should only act in a way that you would want everyone else to act in the same situation. For example, if you think lying is okay, then you'd have to accept that everyone else should lie too, which would make trust impossible. Kant's famous quote, "Act only according to that maxim whereby you can, at the same time, will that it should become a universal law," sums up his approach to morality. But Kant's brilliance came with a downside. His writing was incredibly dense and hard to understand. Even scholars struggle to unpack his ideas, which are filled with complex terms and long, winding sentences. This made Kant a frustrating figure for many readers, who found his work inaccessible and overly intellectual. Some critics even accused him of being out of touch with real-life problems, focusing too much on abstract theories instead of practical solutions. Despite these criticisms, Kant's influence is undeniable. His ideas laid the foundation for modern moral philosophy and inspired countless thinkers to explore the nature of right and wrong. He challenged us to think deeply about our actions and their consequences, reminding us that morality isn't just about following rules. It's about understanding why those rules matter. Love him or hate him, Immanuel Kant's work continues to shape the way we think about ethics and human behavior. Number 6, Jean-Jacques Rousseau. Loved for his social contract theory, hated for his personal life. Jean-Jacques Rousseau is one of the most influential philosophers in history, especially when it comes to ideas about freedom and democracy. He believed that society corrupts people's natural goodness and that true freedom can only be found by returning to a more natural way of life. His concept of the social contract argued that governments should be based on the consent of the people, not on the power of kings or rulers. This idea became a cornerstone of modern democratic thought and inspired revolutions, including the French Revolution. His famous quote, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains," captures his belief that society often restricts our natural freedom, but Rousseau's personal life was far from perfect. And that's where the controversy begins. Despite his lofty ideas about morality and freedom, Rousseau made some questionable choices in his own life. He abandoned his 5 children to an orphanage, a decision he later tried to justify in his writings. He also had a reputation for being difficult and paranoid, often falling out with friends and colleagues. These contradictions made him a target for criticism, with many people accusing him of hypocrisy. How could someone who wrote so passionately about morality and freedom fail to live up to his own ideals? Despite these flaws, Rousseau's ideas remain hugely influential. His work challenged the status quo and inspired people to fight for their rights and freedoms. He showed us that society isn't perfect, and that it's up to us to make it better. Whether you admire him for his ideas or criticize him for his actions, there's no denying that Jean-Jacques Rousseau changed the way we think about freedom, equality, and the role of government. Number 7, Aristotle. Loved for his logic, hated for his elitism. Aristotle is one of the most famous philosophers in history, and for good reason. He was a student of Plato and the teacher of Alexander the Great, and his work laid the foundation for Western philosophy, science, and logic. Aristotle believed in using reason and observation to understand the world, and his ideas about logic, ethics, and politics are still studied today. He famously said, "Man is by nature a political animal," emphasizing the importance of community and governance in human life. His systematic approach to thinking and problem-solving made him a hero to scholars and thinkers for centuries. But Aristotle wasn't without his flaws, and some of his ideas are deeply controversial. For one, he defended slavery, arguing that some people were natural slaves who were better off being ruled by others. He also believed in a strict hierarchy of society, with philosophers and rulers at the top and workers and slaves at the bottom. These elitist views have made him a target of criticism, especially in modern times when equality and human rights are valued more than ever. Critics argue that Aristotle's ideas were shaped by the prejudices of his time, and that his defense of inequality undermines his otherwise brilliant contributions to philosophy. Despite these criticisms, Aristotle's influence is undeniable. His work shaped the way we think about logic, science, and ethics, and his ideas continue to inspire debates about the nature of humanity and society. He may have been a product of his time, but his legacy reminds us that even the greatest thinkers are not perfect. Aristotle's work challenges us to think critically about the world, and about the ideas we choose to accept or reject.